Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and more. Today, we're joined by my dear friend Jeff Escalante on the podcast. Jeff is the Director of Engineering at Clerk currently, but he was formerly the Director of Engineering at Vercel and previously worked at HashiCorp and a number of other places. We actually talk about his background quite a bit in this episode, so I don't need to say more here. The reason we're having this discussion, the reason this episode exists, is because Jeff, in his job at Clerk, wrote an engineering management handbook internally that has such exceedingly great insights about engineering management that I said, Jeff, we have to talk about this on the podcast. You might be thinking, but how did I read it if it was internal to Clerk only? Well, I've been an engineering manager myself for the vast majority of my career, and Jeff and I got to talking, and he said, hey, I'd be willing to share this with you if you can give me some feedback. So I did read it. I did give him some feedback. My feedback was, this is absolutely incredible. More people need to know about this. Come talk about it with me on the podcast. And that's why we're here. In this episode today, it's like the ultimate toolkit to navigate the tech industry from a career perspective, from a recruiting perspective, from an interviewing perspective, from a working perspective. We talk about getting promotions and navigating appraisals and promotions. We talk about if you're hiring, how do you level people? Meaning, how do you know from an interview somebody's mid-level or entry-level, senior, staff, principal, whatever. And if you're on the receiving end of the interview, meaning you're the one being interviewed, we talk about what they look for to give you some tips that you can use in your job to maybe be leveled appropriately instead of less than what you're worth. We talk about navigating ambiguity in the interview process and in the job process, and really that's where the secret sauce is. Like, most recruiters who are somewhat skillful at least will look for, how do you navigate ambiguity? Do you panic and dissolve into a puddle of your own tears? Or do you improvise? Or do you ask the right questions, etc.? Finally, we talk about listening to feedback. Like, Clerk is a feedback-driven product. And we talk about some strategies and protocols they use for taking in feedback, using products like ProductLane, why they chose ProductLane, and understanding really their customers to serve them better. Finally, we talk about navigating relationships, both professional and personal, and balancing like honesty and genuineness, because these are different, right? You can be genuine without being so honest, or you can be honest rather without being a jerk about it. You can tell people the truth, but honoring them, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm just rude, that's how I am. So we talk about these dynamics to help you get the most out of it. Look, Jeff is a skilled engineering leader. This conversation is an enormous privilege for me and for us to listen to and learn from. So I'd encourage you, lean in and let's do it together. Now, I'd like to offer this to all of us at zero cost, and this work is separate to my job and other stuff. The reason we can even do this in the first place is the sponsors. So let's take a moment to honor them. This podcast is honored with this podcast is sponsored by Code Crafters. So Code Crafters teaches the same way I teach, which is by building things from scratch. My most popular talk ever is called Deconstructing React, and it's where we create React components, but we don't import React. And instead we polyfill React. We make React and to understand it. And people came away from this talk going, wow, I get it now. Codecrafters does the same thing. They teach you how Git works, how Docker works, by having you implement them, but in a programming language so you understand the mechanism and you level up your coding skills. It has a free tier, but if you want to start paying, use the Contagious Code link and you get 40% off. That's almost half off. If you want to take advantage of that, tej.as, tej.as/codecrafters. This episode is also sponsored by Stately. That's stately.ai. Stately allows you to visualize your application logic through state charts and state machine diagrams, and then can generate code for you from those, and you get a full-on state machine ready to go. You just fill in business logic. It encourages you to think about retry logic and edge cases that you may not, and then allows you to quickly account for them in code and build them. I love Stately. The founder is a friend, is a future guest on the podcast. And I'd encourage you, give it a try, stately.ai. Wow, that rhymes. Give it a try, stately.ai. In any case, thank you to the sponsors. And now for my discussion with Jeff Escalante. Jeff Escalante, such a pleasure having you on Contagious Code podcast. I'm so excited to talk about management, engineering, all of it, especially from someone like yourself. I mean, HashiCorp, I believe, Vercel, Clerk, what a track record. I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So a lot of folks maybe will miss this context, but we're doing this because you sent me this really awesome handbook for engineering managers, and I read it, and I was so moved that I said we need to have a discussion about this publicly. Before we get into it and all of its details, I'd love it if, for the listeners, you could do a little bit of an introduction to yourself and where you come from, and why you care so much about engineering management. And hopefully that why you care will make it contagious and the rest of us will catch it and also seek the answers you've sought.
Sure, of course. I'll I guess do a full career rewind and step through it, uh, hopefully at a reasonable pace. But I kind of started out doing graphic design actually in like high school, for like random online games that I was playing because it was a way that I could make more online game currency. And so I like figured out how to tinker with Photoshop, which is fun. And eventually I kind of started doing like freelance work throughout high school and college doing graphic design. And somebody at one point asked me to make a website, and I don't know how much this will come out throughout this episode. Depends on how far off the career track we talk about. But one consistent trend for me is whenever anyone asks me to do something that's like kind of crazy, or there's like a opportunity that's like probably won't be able to do it, but there's the opportunity to try it, I'm just gonna like go for it because it's fun and I love learning stuff, and a lot of the time it goes down the tubes because I'm not like a super genius or anything, but like regardless, in the process of trying out something that's like really ambitious and challenging, I learn a lot and I enjoy learning. So someone asked me to make a website. I'm setting this up because I had no idea how to make websites, never made one before, never done anything like that. I was like, oh yeah, I'll do it. Don't worry. So kind of like Googled a bunch of stuff and like barely managed to like piece something together. I mean, it was very terrible, but it looked nice because I was pretty good at design at that point. And that person was thrilled about it, and I got some referrals from them to other people, and it sort of spread from there. And I ended up building this sort of freelance web development like side project throughout my college years. Come to the end of college, I was like, I kind of like doing this, and this is something that people will pay you to do. Whereas everything I'd been studying, I didn't quite feel the same way about. And so I started kind of looking for jobs in web development, despite not really having any credentials and just having done this freelance work. Um, that's pretty much it. And I ended up getting really lucky and landing an internship at an agency in New York City, called Carrot Creative. You want me to pause at any point here? Or
No,
just keep
that's good.
going?
I'm just smiling because this is exactly my journey, exactly the same. I started with
Amazing.
graphics. I started with games and
Yeah,
then graphics and then
yeah.
making websites, and
Mm-hmm.
then yeah, my first job was with a creative agency also. No, so
Yeah,
I'm just like, whoa, how is
that's
this
awesome.
so common?
Yeah,
But
I
no, please
wonder. I
keep
wonder
going.
if it's more common than this. Now you've got me thinking. Um, but yeah, I mean, I loved working at the agency. I think it was a great first sort of opportunity because I got to try so many different things. It wasn't like on board to one big project and stick with it. I had a million different projects, and I remember I was writing code for IE5, good times. I was writing PHP, good times. I was figuring out Ruby on Rails, and so it was really nice, and I'm super grateful for that opportunity. And fun fact, the guy who hired me to that internship originally, um, I am still working with all the way through all of the companies that I've worked at, all the way to clerk.
What
And
does he work at
uh,
Clerk?
yeah, he does. It's it's
What?
it's Kyle. And so it's been a crazy, like very, very long term, like really wonderful working relationship that I'm grateful there. But we could talk about that later if you want. Just an interesting detail. I'm like, Kyle is the guy who like made it happen for me originally.
Wow.
Um, and so eventually that agency got bought by Vice Media, which is now I think bankrupt of some shape or form, or on the path to that. Which at the time it was like a really cool and interesting company. Um, but it became relatively clear quickly that it was a bit of a mess. And a few years after the acquisition, the creative agency sort of started to fall apart. Not because of anything that we were doing. Now I'm like really getting into the weeds, but I think these are maybe interesting stories.
That's okay. Yeah, I don't know.
At,
That's
at
why you're
one
here.
point, they got rid of the they got rid of the business development team that like got the agency our like jobs. Um, and they're like they went to Kyle, who was running the dev team that I was on at the time, and they're like, "Look, we don't have any like we don't have any work for you guys, so like probably you're gonna have to wind this down, and like everyone's gonna get laid off." Um, and he was like, "Well, that would suck because we had a good thing going on. Like, despite the like surrounding chaos, this development team was like really pretty well put together." We were like, "What if we get our own business?" And they're like, "Well, then that would be fine, I guess, right? As long as you're making more than we're paying you, like we'll keep you on here." So I started pitching new business with Kyle at the time in order to keep this thing alive, which was really very wild. I think that qualifies as one of those have no idea what you're doing, but just go for it anyway, like moments. And we got enough contracts to keep it going for a little bit longer, which was really cool. And funny enough, one of those contracts that we pitched was HashiCorp. Um, and so we did a pitch to them. We ended up winning the business, and then I went and worked on it because I was like, okay, well, we need somebody to work on it. And eventually things kind of fell apart a little bit more with Vice, and it like became clear that wouldn't be able to keep this going much longer. So Kyle went around and talked to everyone and was like, hey, look, like we're probably all gonna have to find new jobs. Like we'll figure it out. But I just want to let you know, which is very thoughtful. And At the time, I also had some interest from HashiCorp and like bringing me on more full time. They had worked with me on this contract for a while, and they're like, the agency rate's really high. We obviously need somebody on this like long term. So like, we want to like offer you a job. And I was like, I'm there's probably some law being broken here in some way, and like I'm not going to talk about this. Like I'm not going to talk about this with you. Like you got to go talk to my boss. I'm not going to get involved in any of this. Um, and so they went to talk to him, and then he came to talk to me, and I thought this was going to be this really stressful conversation of like, because it was a cool company. I really enjoyed working with them. I enjoyed working on the contract. I had been on it for months. I was invested in it, and they offered me like way more, frankly, like way more than I was making at the agency, which is still a good deal for them if you compare the price that I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with agency prices. They're quite high. I think we're like 400 plus an hour, which is crazy. I wish I made 400 plus an hour. That would be nice. Um, but I thought it was going to be this very dramatic conversation. And he was like, well, actually, this is great. You should take that offer. It's a great offer. I was like, what? I was blown away. I mean, I was like really nervous about the conversation and where it was going to go because I cared so much about the agency. I had been with them for so long. I think I was there for 7+ years. Um, but that ended up being the end of that little part of the journey. I don't know. Now I'm just rambling. You want me to keep going through the rest of the career history, or do you want me
Whatever
to
you want.
fast
You're here.
forward?
Whatever
Cool.
you like. We have enough time for all of it.
Um, okay. All right. Well, the rest of it is much more brief. I went over to work at HashiCorp. At the time that the department being built out was like supposed to be responsible for all their websites. Obviously, I'd worked on websites a lot, so this is in my wheelhouse. But I wasn't like working on HashiCorp's products. I was working on all of HashiCorp's websites, which is documentation for all their products, their marketing site. They had like community forums. They had a lot of websites. They had like 20 websites.
When you say working on the websites,
Mhm.
and your background, I mean, the whole topic of this conversation is engineering management. So when you say working on
Mhm.
these websites, were you like IC, like writing code and shipping them, or were you
Yeah.
managing the engineering teams?
Well, there wasn't an engineering team, so it was me.
Okay.
And so I had to do the work because there wasn't anyone else doing it. And the website ownership was kind of like distributed among several places within the company. Maybe this is an interesting topic for later. Um, and so part of that process was also like attempting to consolidate ownership under this one department, which was the goal of the department. It would a lot of the other people working on HashiCorp tools like wanted to work on HashiCorp tools, and working on the website or the documentation for it was like a side project, and not in their core expertise either, because they were like Go developers and not web developers. And so there was this interesting phase of like coming on there to a project I was already familiar with, to a company I was already familiar with, but like in a different capacity, trying to put together a small team, trying to navigate the political landscape of being like, hey, like we want to take this off your plate without it being like offensive, and with it like being positive, and effectively becoming like an internal agency for the company, because we were connected to everybody. Like sales had stuff they wanted on the website, marketing had stuff they wanted on there, engineering had stuff they wanted on there. So we like had to create this little like internal agency within the company. But it worked out pretty well. Eventually, we got there. That was the time where we started investing like pretty heavily in Next.js. Because at the time I was looking for a tool that would um, take care of the company's cart needs, which were like just static, like websites. They were like mostly like marketing sites, doc sites. But HashiCorp was growing crazy, crazy fast, and doing really well as a company. And the marketing team had like really high ambitions for like what they wanted on the website, which were reasonable. And I was like, I don't want to lock us into a static build, because I know that we're going to outgrow that as the company grows, and I want to make an investment in a foundation that's going to like scale with the company, because the company is scaling very fast at the time. Um, but I also don't want to go overboard and make some super like very like overly complicated thing now that slows us down just for the eventual reality of scale. And this like essential conflict is what like led us um, into Next.js, because it was the closest thing I could find to a tool that would let you generate a static website and run a dynamic website off the same code base. But at the time, it wasn't quite there yet. And so we patched it. I patched it like crazy. I went into the Webpack configuration, and I made these crazy plugins that would like get it across the line to, and eventually reach this point where like I could take one code base, and I had a Heroku deployment and I had a static site deployment of the same code base with no modifications. And I was like very pumped about this, um, because that was the goal, is just having that ability at the foundation. So this was like the big like architecture project that I worked on at the beginning of my time at HashiCorp. And through that, I got a lot more familiar with Next.js. And through my insane hackery, I ended up connecting with the team on more things, and some of the ideas that we developed ended up getting absorbed back into the project, which is great. Nothing could make me happier than that. I had this big plugin package that was like HashiCorp Next plugin, and it was huge, and it was full of all this stuff. And over the years, it got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as these things went upstream into Next, and eventually it was gone. And I was very pleased by this, because the best code to maintain is no code.
Yes.
Um,
Well, at that point, it
yeah,
was only a matter of time until you got absorbed into Next.js.
yeah, exactly. So near the end of my time at HashiCorp, we sort of had a big enough and a talented enough team that I ended up being and making sense for me to pivot into more on the management side, which was great. I had flipped back and forth a couple times during my time there, between IC and management. Like I started out as IC because I was the only one, and then since I was the first one there, we hired a couple people, and they're like, now you're going to be a manager. And frankly, I had a really bad experience, with this, because we didn't have the IC firepower, um, to like make it happen. Like we didn't have like an architect, and that was the work I was doing previously. And now I was being asked to do that and also management. And so I did a worse job of being the architect, and I did a worse job of being the manager, and it was really stressful. And I actually bailed. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't like management. I don't think I'm cut out for it. It's not really the career path that I want. So I'm going to try to hire, promote somebody else to manager, and I'll go back to being IC. And so I did. I had a colleague who I thought was really great and had a good sense with people, and promoted him as the manager and went back to being an IC. And I thought that was it for me. And that was the point where I started like reading the staff end stuff. And I was like, okay, this is the career pathway. Not that I'm like, career progression obsessed by any means, but like I wanted to know where I was going. There's kind of this
Yeah.
nebulous, like you're a software engineer, and you're a software engineer. And I felt this I flipped back and forth between manager and software, and I felt like kind of disillusioned with like where my career was going, and I was kind of confused about it for a while. Um, and eventually, we had strong enough engineering talent that um, realistically, we managed to hire someone who I felt like could take my job. That was the impetus, and so I passed off my entire job, and I was like, okay, let's give this another shot, and it was a whole different story, frankly. It
Wow.
was a completely different story that I really, really enjoyed. Um, and when I have that capability, I'm in that position, I enjoy it a lot to this day. But it was something that I hadn't really thought about. That it was like, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more. It's been on my mind a lot recently. But like, management is a luxury. Management is
Yeah.
a luxury that you can afford when you have a strong enough team that they can get the work done. Because if you have
Mm.
to make a choice, I'll take a lead IC or a manager, and that's the only person that's on the team. You take the IC. The manager isn't doing anything. Or if you don't have strong enough IC talent, or you know, but you have a great manager, your team is still not gonna
Yeah.
your team's not gonna be getting anywhere with that. And
Yeah.
so it took getting to that point through stumbles naturally for me to like really connect with that job and be like, oh, look how fulfilling this can be. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, okay. Let me
Well,
pause for a sec. Go
yeah,
ahead.
sure. It's so what I'm hearing is, and you talk about this in your handbook as well, right? Like
Hmm.
ICs and managers are so different. And managers, I think you say this, and also Ryan Burgess, who was formerly at Netflix.
Great guy. Yeah.
Keep great guy. Keep saying, no, managers do not code. Managers do
Hmm.
not code. And you just alluded to it here as well. When you tried to do both, you had a hard time. You struggled. But then when you
Very hard time.
had the IC power,
Yeah.
sorry, what was that?
A very hard time.
Yeah,
For
yeah. And
sure.
so when you had the IC power, everything changed and management became so much easier. Now, I've been in a position myself where I was the only IC on a front end team, and they hired like three folks, and they were like, "Oh, everybody's stepping on each other's toes, and everybody's doing the same thing. We need a manager." And so then they made me the manager because of I was there the longest in terms of tenure, and that was
Sure.
my sort of getting into engineering management. But the expectations over time were that I would also contribute code, and I share your experience, man. I really struggled with that. Um, how do you,
It's a
for people
common
listening,
expectation, to be clear. I mean, I see it all the time. Um, all the time.
which then begs the question for listeners of this podcast, right? Since it's so common, what protocols, what advice can we give to people listening to navigate that transition? If
Yeah.
there's a new manager like me, like you, who's like, hey, manage, oh, but also code. How can one navigate
Yeah.
that in the way that best serves the organization and the the self?
I think I actually have a very clear answer for that, thankfully. Maybe the only question that I do. We'll see. But at least for me, in my experience, the answer is make sure that your entire job is taken care of before you take on another job. If someone says, we want to make you manager, you move over to manager, and what you're doing now is now vacant, that's not a good situation, right? Like that, I mean, you can always externalize blame for anything. I try to do the opposite for everything. If you feel like if you're given an opportunity to change to a different job, at least in my mind, you're responsible for ensuring that your current job is taken care of well before you can do that. Because if you don't, you end up with this gaping void and everything starts falling apart. Or they expect you to do both, right?
Mm,
Which is usually it's the latter. And so typically, I mean, I don't want to make too much generalizations, but I feel like usually companies are not going to do this for you. And if you would like to move in the direction of being a manager, you need to be aware that you need to replace yourself as an IC. If you start as an IC and you want to be manager, you need to be aware that it's on you to ensure that you have replaced yourself as an IC before you move there. Um, if that makes any sense.
yeah, why is that on the employee? Why is that not on the manager? I mean, in this case, there is no manager, but there's maybe
Yeah.
a director or a CEO or something. And I'm asking this not like almost rhetorically because it does happen. It just happens that nobody else is looking out for the fulfillment of
Yeah.
position A when transitioning to position B, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I think you say it's on the individual making that transition. But what is there some way that we can somehow make it not the responsibility of the? It's sort of like feed yourself because your parents aren't going to feed you mentality, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
is that adaptive for companies? Is there better,
It would be great. I don't know if there's like a way we could fix the problem across the board, but like as an exec at a company in general, it's hopefully something that you'd be aware of is that you can't just like rotate someone into a new position and expect it to be picked up. There has to be like a transition period where
uh,
somebody else is groomed to take over that person's job before they have the ability to shift. And it can't just be like,
is
we made a new hire. Okay, now this person's going to be the manager, right? And a lot of time that is the case. It's like, what is it, like 6 to 8 is a team size? It's pretty average for like you want to have a manager. And that's an average manager load. So it might be like company hires sixth person. Okay, this team needs a manager. This person's promoted to manager. The theory is there, right? And you're like, okay, well, we've replaced them, right? We have a new hire. But in reality, is that new hire able to take over the person who promoted his job, especially if, like you were mentioning earlier, they usually promote the most tenured person, right? Which is also probably folly for a variety of reasons, but like that's usually what happens. So you bring in a brand new person who's just starting on board, you offload your most experienced person. Like that doesn't sound like you've covered the gaps to me, right?
yeah. Yeah, for sure. As director of engineering at Vercel and now clerk, have you had to do that? Like promote somebody, you hired an extra team member, or maybe not even hire an extra team member, but you have a report who wants to go from IC to manager, and
Yeah.
you've had to help them through that. What did
Yeah.
that look like?
It was a gradual process, at least for me, um, of kind of establishing like a mutual interest in it. I mean, I definitely, first of all, don't ever want someone to be promoted without them wanting that and understanding what it means, right? I've spoken with plenty of people who want the promotion because it's a promotion, and oftentimes within companies, and you mentioned this earlier in a snippet, so maybe we'll cover this, but like people often view manager as like, okay, this is a step up in my career from IC. You go from IC to manager, and that's like now you've gotten a big raise, you're more important, your job is worth more. So people often want the promotion. Um, but if you are being thoughtful as a director, I guess you want to make sure they actually want the job. And if you're doing things like I recommend doing them, they understand that it is not actually a promotion, which is a very difficult thing to undo. Like I've talked to plenty of people who I tell them this explicitly on multiple occasions, and it doesn't shake that. They don't really internalize that, and they still kind of see it as like this is a step forward for my career rather than a step into a different career
Yeah,
laterally. Um, because it's something that's so ingrained, right? I mean, that's the way it is at many companies. That may have been the way that it is for years and years of your career. So like, it's understandable, but like establishing that the person actually wants that job, I think, is like the first step for me, and that takes a while usually. Um, and it takes a bunch of conversations, and then making sure you feel like that person's going to be successful in that job and comfortable in that role, and like we talked about earlier, that they have a backfill for their own work if that's necessary. Um, and so, I guess to address the original question, like for me, it's a series of conversations that spans over weeks, probably months, um, and is kind of like trying to fit in these like bricks. I had this like diagram that I drew of like leaves, like plants, like
mm-hmm.
vines growing up a wall, and I feel like teams are made up of all these different vines that like twist through each other, and some are below other ones and support other ones, and like it's easy to think of it as like a nice clean hierarchy where like everything splits out, but the reality is there's a lot of different things. And you can't just like make a cut here and like paste it over there without considering what happens to that empty space, right? Sometimes if you have too much like junior or too much senior engineering talent on a team, you might need to make space for somebody to grow into a larger role, right? If they're bumping up against the ceiling of like what you need, you might need to prune, not like fire anybody, but like make a move so that in some way, so that person has space to go up. Sometimes it's not, but thinking about the how the tree shape changes, how the vine shape changes, I guess, when you do make that move is another piece of it that you're doing in the background, um, of having the conversations with that person and making sure that the rest of the company's like teams and like leadership and et cetera are like down with that, and that is fine. So I don't know. That was a pretty vague description, but I hope
No,
I hope it answered the question.
that's really, it really does. Yeah, I love the fact that you even make sure that it's one something they want, and you highlight
Yeah.
that it's because it's not really a vertical step but a lateral
Mm-hmm.
step. I actually stole that. I just did a podcast
Yeah.
with where I was a guest with Michelle Bakels from G2I, and
Mm-hmm.
she asked me about that, and I said, "Yeah, Jeff Escalante." I literally like I cited you and everything, and I was like, "No, he says
Thanks,
it's a
man. I
lateral
appreciate
step, so it is a lateral step."
it.
Um, I think it's important. I think it's important to address, but also there are vertical steps. And for somebody who really likes writing code, and at the end of the day just wants some more responsibility, wants to have bigger impact, wants to get paid more, you know, they may not want to be a manager, but they may want to go from like senior to staff or staff to
Yes,
principal or something like that.
absolutely.
I want to get your input on a situation I had to deal with once
Okay.
at a
Yeah,
former job. It's consulting for free. I apologize. Feel free to invoice me after. But I'm really curious about
I'll
this
send
because
it out.
I thanks. I was offered a staff level position a
Mm-hmm.
long time ago, and I accepted it and was told just before they sent me the final contract to sign, oh, actually, we went over it again, and we're going to offer you a senior position.
Mm-hmm.
But like within the first 3 months, we're gonna revisit that. You're probably going to be staff. We just want to be conservative. And I said, okay, that's fine.
Yep.
Joined the company, and
Yeah.
nothing happened. Nothing happened. And eventually, the staff, so it was one staff engineer, one senior engineer, and like three level twos
Mm-hmm.
on the team. And so I was the senior. At some point, the staff engineer quit, just left.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did then was they started searching for an external staff engineer. So they put out job application, excuse
Yep.
me, they put out job descriptions, and just tried to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
that route.
Yeah.
I spoke to my manager, my engineering manager, and I said, "What's going on? I thought I would like I you know."
Yeah.
Um, and the response he gave me left a lasting impact. And I think about this often as I manage teams and so on. Is he said, "Well, there's a reason we didn't think of you for the staff engineering position immediately that is
Mm-hmm.
now vacant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because we typically promote based on what we see. So if you're a senior and you're acting like a staff engineer, then we'll notice and then we'll consider you for the promotion.
Yep.
Similarly, if you're an engineer too and you're acting senior, meaning you're doing some mentorship, and every company defines this stuff slightly differently, right? So if we see evidence of that, then we'll start the conversation. And in this
Yep.
case, we decided to look externally because you've just been functioning as a senior. I thought that was really interesting, and it was
Mm-hmm.
definitely not what I expected. I'm curious, have you faced similar situations both as a manager or as an IC?
Yeah.
If you were director of this engineering manager, what would you say? What's the best way to engage in this situation?
You may hate me for this, but I kind of agree. That's more or less my same policy. I think that when you start acting that way, it demonstrates that you are 100% ready for it naturally without having to be prompted. And I probably will catch some heat for this, and you can feel free to feel free to debate me on it. I won't be offended at all, because I think it's easy to make a counterpoint of like, well, like if the expectations aren't set in this way, then like how could you expect somebody to do it?
Mm,
But in my experience, I have found that the people who are effective in those roles will just do it even without the expectations set because it's just how they operate. Like there are some people who you give a code project and they will execute on that code project and do a good job of that code project and finish it and move on to another one. There are other people who you give a code project and they'll execute on the code project, but like their field of vision is wider. They'll see
mm,
how other people are interacting with the code project. They'll get feedback from this side. They'll think about how like marketing is going to interact with this. They'll think about how it affects other code projects that are going on at the company at the time. They'll see how people are leaving comments on an RFC and read into those and be like, is this person like feeling a little threatened by this, or like there just are like, I think the process of promotion is just a gradual expansion of your like field of vision. And it's the same
Wow.
way with increasing responsibility, right? The more that you see and take in into factor in the way that you work in a project, the more of an impact you can have and the more value you have. And I don't ever want to force somebody to expand their field of vision early, because that's stressful and it will lead to them failing. Um, and then that sucks, right? Like I would rather under level somebody and let them comfortably move up to that level at the pace that they want than over level them, say, and then say, hey, look, you're not meeting expectations, like you're fired. Like that's terrible, right? Like you absolutely don't want that to happen. Um, and I guess I know a lot of people are looking for advancement and promotion, and I'll talk about this expansion of responsibility and expansion of vision for folks who are asking me about it, but there's not like it's not like a checklist, right? You know, like you
Mm.
don't have a checklist to like do this and do this and do this and then you get a promotion. I mean, some companies do, but you know, probably know how I feel about that. I think it's just something that will happen naturally
Yeah.
as you grow in your career and as you grow within your company and as you gather context. And it's really frustrating, I think, for people to hear that, honestly, from me. So maybe I need to take that as feedback. Maybe I'm wrong about it, but it doesn't put anyone in a position where they're uncomfortable. And it tends to be a pretty accurate read of how folks move through those positions in a sustainable way. Sorry, I'm done talking now. You can fire back.
No, no, keep talking. You're here as a guest.
Mm,
everybody is tuning in,
mm.
and by everybody I mean three people are tuning in to hear this. So okay, I have some counters to that.
Yeah, please.
Mainly, and I don't disagree with you. I think for a healthy, well-run business with great people like yourself, I would trust that. Like if you were my manager, you were the director of engineering, and you said, "Hey, when you start acting like it, I will." And I love that you said, let people level up at their own pace, because this is sort of like how we grow as human beings, right? Like you don't
Hmm.
force a child to start
For
talking or
sure.
walking. You
Yeah.
just like wait till
Yeah.
the the vision field will literally expand as the child grows, right? And so, not to say everybody's a child, but growth as a metaphor. So I
And I'm
see
sure
that.
you've like seen your own vision field expand too over the course of your career. You know, you think back to how it was when you were junior. I was like, if I can just solve this problem in front of me, like
Yeah,
that would be amazing, you know?
yeah,
And it makes sense. And now that's like not a consideration anymore.
yeah,
Right? Like,
yeah. And I truly believe, actually. So I've had the privilege of getting a few compliments on this podcast, and people say, "Hey, you ask such insightful questions," and it's because I feel, and I'm trying not to toot my own horn, but I feel like I have a vision level that's wide enough that I can ask questions that people consider interesting anyway. Okay, but I was countering your point. My
yes,
my
please.
counter is my counter is this works. What you're saying works really well in an ideal scenario.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, the industry is far from ideal,
Oh yeah.
and companies are far from ideal. For example, this is just an attack vector, right? For people who really want that promotion, who will act like a senior, will do what they think is senior behavior, which may not be wide field of vision. And maybe I'm going to work nights and weekends and really earn that promotion.
Yeah.
But the people and the powers that be could just be like, yeah, you're not acting like it. Because who defines acts like a senior? And it could just be an ever moving, dangling
Yeah.
carrot in front of an
It
animal.
could
So,
be. It definitely could be,
so
right? You can misuse it. I'm sure companies have misused it, and the hardest thing is to know if it's being weaponized against you or if you're overestimating your own abilities. Right? I
yeah,
think that's the hardest thing in the world, and I've heard so many different sides of that perspective. It's just really, really difficult, you know? And ultimately, I think if you are really confident that it's being weaponized against you, then the answer is you go get a new job, as much as that
yeah,
sucks. But
yeah,
typically, at least having sat at the layer that I'm sitting at, it usually is not like an individual thing. It's usually a comparative thing. If you have a couple of staff engineers and you have someone else who's gunning for that, are they as effective or on the borderline as effective as the other people are in that position currently. Um, and typically that is how those decisions are made by whatever, like directors or like executives or whatever. Is not just like, I don't really feel like, this guy's this guy's staff. It's more of like
Mm,
it's more of a comparison usually.
yeah. Yeah. I will say in defense of this company where I had that arrangement, I my manager told me, he said, go find a staff engineer and just shadow them. And learn from them. Spend all of your time. Just hang out with the staff engineers nonstop, and then you'll see what they do. And like you said, it's a comparison thing, right? So then
Yeah.
you'll see what they do, and then you do that, and then you'll get the promotion. Let's revisit in 3 months or so, and we'll definitely get you that. And I want to get, the manager was even like, I'm on your side. I want you to get that,
For
but I
sure.
need you to start acting like it. And how you can start acting like it is by spending time with other staff engineers to see what it looks like at this specific company. So it was really nice of him.
And it's so different between
Unfortunate,
companies too, right? Like
yeah,
you could, and perhaps have since, but like you can go get a staff position at some company, even as a junior. You can go get a staff position for sure. Some company will give it to you.
yeah,
What does that tell you? Not that much. I
yeah,
mean, the scope is within the company, like you're just saying.
yeah,
It's just like, and every company's scope is different. And frankly, I'm thrilled if there's a company where they're like, you're not enough to get this promotion here, because I'm like, great, then there's more meat on the bone for me here, right? Like, there's a lot more for me to learn and there's more for me to grow.
yeah,
Um, that being said, I understand. I totally understand if somebody feels a little frustrated by it, especially, in the position you're in. But like,
yeah,
I think you can pivot that around to something to be grateful for.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I did spend a lot of time, just to finish out the story for those
Mm.
interested who are invested now. I did go find the staff engineer. Spent a lot of time. He was an absolute gem of a human being.
Mm.
Um, and I eventually, as I was in the, it was going to take 3 months, and in those 3 months, a random founder reached out to me and offered me a job with 30,000 more dollars a year, and I was like, oh, early
Decent amount.
startup. I can move fast. I can learn rapidly, and there's more money. Come on. And so, like you said, in some cases, you just go find a new job if this one isn't what you wanted it to
Yeah,
be.
sometimes.
Can we talk a little bit about leveling folks? Because you mentioned you'd rather under level than over level, because if
Mhm.
you under level, then people will comfortably rise to the level that
Yes.
they're at. And if you over level, you set this unrealistic expectation and you have to fire someone or they quit out of frustration.
Usually you
What's the
don't
best
down
way?
level someone is the problem, right? Like,
Yeah.
when's the last time you heard of somebody being down leveled within a company
And then
and
staying for more
staying,
than a month.
right?
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's the danger is like you want to be very conservative with the way that you set levels straight off the bat for
Yeah.
that reason. And I mean, it's kind of unfortunate because if down leveling were more normal or acceptable, then I think that would be fine to go in either direction, but like it's not.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead though. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I'm glad. People criticize me that I interrupt too much, so I'm happy that someone else is doing it for once. Um, okay, no, but like, I hear that, and it's sort of like getting married. In the most cases, this is like a lifelong choice, and so you want to be sure, like, because you can't down level, so to speak. I don't know if
Yeah,
this analogy is landing. It's probably not. I'm getting in trouble, but I stand by
probably.
it. It's a it's a long commitment that's hard to reverse.
Hmm.
What are some strategies for nailing this, for dialing this in? I mean, I imagine you've leveled hundreds of folks, right? And yes, I hear bias towards under leveling, but instead of over leveling, but there has to be some type of protocol to do this well. To be like, I think based on all of what I've seen in the interviews and in your resume and
Mm.
your past experience, you are at this level, and then providing like a basis for that.
Yeah,
I'm curious if you could speak to that for.
I don't usually give that out straight off the bat to people in interviews, but I do form it in my mind, and there are a couple of tools that I'll use for it. One of them is the tech screen. How does somebody do on a tech screen? Obviously, right? If it's for a technical position, it's not like I'm looking for anything particular, but you can tell a lot from the way that people kind of put together and structure their code, how much they've been through, how overwrought it is, how simple it is, what kind of questions they ask about it. And I will always give out tech screens that are purposely ambiguous. because that's how real life projects work. You don't get a nice, clean, organized spec that you implement to the T and there are no oversights in it. You get some kind of mess. And I think it's not that hard to find an engineer who you can give a really clear, really cleaned up spec, and you'll get something back out of it. In fact, you probably just take that to AI, right, and get back what you want. Maybe the only situation where you could, frankly. Um, but that's just not how things happen in the real world. And so, yeah, I have three pillars here. We'll do them one by one. I'll pause after each one. So the text screen is part of it, and the purposely ambiguous text screen is a big part of it, because if the what I'm looking for in this is generally, how do you handle the ambiguity? Do you make a decision on your own and move forward? Do you ask about it in an open-ended manner, expecting somebody to give you an answer? Or do you note the ambiguity, come up with a couple of ways that you think would be good, appropriate to handle it, think of one that you think you're leaning towards as the suggested one, and then pose that as the question. Hey, I noticed there's ambiguity here in this way. Here's a couple ways that I think I can handle it. This is the way that I'm thinking about going. What do you think? That's the type of thing that I want to see every single time with ambiguity, because it's not expecting someone else to do the work for you. It's noticing the ambiguity. It's thinking about the problem, and it's giving whoever is managing you or working with you a very clean, easy way to move forward. Here's a couple of a brief, no more than 3 choices of how we can handle this ambiguity. Here's the one I recommend, and here's why. And the easiest case is you read that message, you sign off on it. Sounds good? I think the one you chose makes sense. The alternative is one of the other ones makes sense more, and you can now have an interesting debate about it, which is great, actually, and is the best thing in software engineering, because it strengthens your conclusion the more that you debate it. And then the other alternative is there's maybe one that wasn't on the list that somebody comes up with and suggests, and it becomes part of the suggestion. But that's the peak answer I'm after. There's a spectrum in between, and in that spectrum lies my leveling hints, right?
Right.
The lowest level is nothing is said about it at all. And that's usually you don't get past the interview, frankly, because if you just are not noticing something that's ambiguous or making an arbitrary choice, not feeling that there are different options, it's dangerous. And that's how you end up shipping bad stuff, right?
Yeah.
And not working together as a team,
Yeah.
as a company, to make decisions on how to make the best stuff. If you're just over in the corner going bang, 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 here, I'm just going to make all these
Yeah.
calls on my own. No matter how good you are at making those calls, it's just not going to work
Yeah.
out. You have to work together.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop after that. What do you think?
Good. Yeah. No, that is so great. Can I share how I would deal with an interview step like that? I would find the ambiguity, and this is I've actually done this. Multiple times I've done this. I find the ambiguity, I make a note of the ambiguity, I come up with the 3 options as you mentioned, but then I implement one. And so, like, if it's code, what I'll do is I'll note the ambiguities and I'll commit, and then I'll check out a new branch for the thing that I think is the best solution, and I'll continue fixing it with my workaround solution, whatever it may be. And then, whenever I submit this thing, I'm going to be like, here's the final thing. Here's the decision point. Here are 3 things to get around this ambiguity. Like, I tend to be, as many listeners of this podcast know, pretty verbose. And so, yeah, that's what that would result in. It's solved
I think
this
that's
way,
fine.
which I think was,
I
yeah.
would only slightly, I would only slightly undermark that, because if you went ahead with implementing the thing you suggested and a discussion was had and you went another direction, we waste a little bit of time implementing it. If there's some reason that you did that, like you're supremely confident in it, we're on a tight deadline, like, obviously there's situations where it works out, but as a standard,
Yeah.
I want to see make a very clear call out, arrive as a group as a conclusion, and then start implementing it. I mean, take that
That's
for what it's worth.
no. I want to discuss this more. And by the way, I think it's kind of cool that you're just giving away the answers here.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I shouldn't do that. We're
I
gonna have a
mean,
lot
that's
of really
why people.
strong interviews at Clerk here in the coming months.
Yeah, but we're teaching them the skills that you
Mhm.
want, so it's actually quite cool. We're
Yeah.
making better engineers here at Contagious Code. But okay, no, but I think this is so cool because I never thought about that time waste, and here's why. Because if this is an interview process,
Mhm.
then I go up to the decision point, I note the ambiguities, I come up with action steps, and then between that point in time and the time we talk, nothing happens. And
Oh
so
yeah. So
that
we do the
that's why
interview
I go in.
slightly differently. We put you in a Slack channel and we say we want you to ask questions. This is an ambiguous challenge. If you don't ask questions about it, interact with us, you will fail the interview. So please do it. And there are
Wow.
plenty of people who don't ask a single question and go through it like a normal interview. But that just, indicates you didn't really read the instructions, and that's the type of thing that will get you rejected, unfortunately. I mean,
That's
yeah.
so okay.
Yeah, I
I
always,
see.
because
Yeah.
otherwise I'm just testing what happens if I put this person in a silo, and that's not what I want to know, because that's not how
Yeah.
we work, is in a silo. I
That's
mean,
such a good
some
takeaway. So
people do, to be fair, but like, not
yeah.
not my teams.
What's the average turnaround if somebody says, "Hey, I noticed this ambiguity here"? Is that because that would also factor into my soldiering on ahead with my best solution? If
Yeah,
it takes like more than a day, I'm gonna be like, okay, well, nobody cares about this as much as I do, so I'm just gonna.
that's true. It does depend. We try to be really good about getting those questions answered. Sometimes people ask them in the evening. Some people ask them on the weekends. I certainly don't always go on Slack in the evenings and weekends and answer stuff, and I don't expect any of my engineers to either. So if you're asking them at off hours, you may need to wait until the next day cycle. Sometimes I'm on anyway on my computer. I see the message. I can get a quick answer in there, or someone else can. But I guess that's my best answer. Like
Okay.
if you're doing it during work hours, you get an answer because it's in our Slack. And if you're
So
doing it
cool.
off hours, hopefully you get an answer. But I'm not expecting myself or anybody else to be putting in work time off hours giving answers because that's just not a fair expectation.
Yeah, that's so cool. So that's like being in the Slack channel for the
Yeah.
interview. I've never seen that done. I think that's so cool because you're like it's like a work trial. You're
Yeah,
literally like, here,
exactly.
come work for us
I
as you
like work
would.
trials even more than that. I used to do contract to hire for everyone. So I'd do a basic interview and then I'd be like, let's do a contract. And if it wasn't working out after a week, it's like, okay, you got paid for your work. We appreciated you working here, but like, we're not going to extend the contract. And if it was, then we can
Yeah.
go hire. And it was great. I loved contract to hire, but reasonably, it's not something that happens a lot of bigger companies because I guess I don't really know. There's some HR and legal problems with it. Every time I've
Yeah.
tried it, HR and legal has come to me and be like, we can't do this because like it's not a normal thing to do. And I was like, but we really like it. It's really effective for us. Like the people who have been hired here through it like it. Um, but they're just like, no, it's the same thing with international hiring. I've banged against this time after time, company after company. I'm like, why can't we just hire people from any country? And they're like, oh, there's legal
Wait.
reasons. I'm like, what are the legal
Wait.
reasons?
Everyone at Clerk has to be in the U.S.
No, no, not a
Oh.
clerk. I mean, but
Okay.
as I've said, I bet eventually, as the company grows, they will start restricting countries it can hire from because I've never
Yeah.
come across a company who this hasn't happened to. And I've also never gotten a clear answer exactly as to why, but whatever. Where did I even get sidetracked on the start of this?
Yes. Yes.
Uh,
Let's go to that second pillar you mentioned.
yeah, okay. Um, so off of the interviews, I had something that I was like trying to finish up there though. Now it's trying to drive me crazy. I got sidetracked into international hiring. What was it? Oh, it was contract to hire. Yeah. So I mean, love
Yeah.
contract to hire, but it doesn't often work out. And also, obviously, like not every if you have a full-time job, not everyone's going to do a contract, quit their job, do a contract, and then maybe not actually get the position. So I understand it. Anyway, yes. Second pillar. I would say the easiest one to discuss next is probably my vision scope leveling question that I ask people in interviews. So now I'm really giving away the secret sauce. But it's just for you.
Well, it's
um,
also so people listen and learn and
yeah,
become actual
yeah, yeah,
seniors. How
yeah.
cool would it be if
But
we
don't
create like
don't
a whole
don't
bunch
cheat the
of.
system though. And be honest with your. Now that I'm giving away my question, I ask you if you're gonna come interview with me or somebody else in my company after that. Don't try to cheat the system. It won't serve you well.
And if the listeners do cheat the system, I know a guy. You
No,
better
yeah,
watch out.
yeah. Better
That's
watch
all I'm
out.
saying.
um, so I will generally ask in interviews if I'll like kind of frame up this question and be like, I like to know when you're working, um, what type of like amount of like ambiguity and like responsibility you're like really confident working within, because there are different levels of that with between companies and within companies. And so I'm gonna like draw out a kind of spectrum for you here, and I would like you to tell me where on that spectrum you feel comfortable and confident working. On one end of the spectrum is you're given a clearly defined like project, um, and you work or like sorry, you're given a clearly defined like ticket, like an issue ticket that's like do this thing within a project or a series of them within a project that you're working on, and you can go through them and go bang 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 and finish out those tickets, um, as part of a way to get the project done. Okay, so that's one side. We move one step towards the other side. Is you're given a project that's clearly defined. It's very apparent what needs to be done for the project, but the specifics of how it gets done are undefined. So you need to be the one to create the like tickets if that's how you prefer to work, and work through them in order to get the project done. The next step is you're given a problem. The problem is also clearly defined, but how the problem needs to be solved is not apparent. It might be a project, it might be several projects, it might not be a project, but given that problem, it is your responsibility to figure out a solution to it.
Can I interrupt here and
Yeah,
ask one question?
mhm.
What is the scope of the problem? Is the problem like the company is not making any money, make it
Could be
make
that.
money, or is
Yep.
it?
Oh yeah.
Whoa, okay.
Sure. It could be anything. And then the most extreme opposite end of the spectrum is you aren't given anything, and you're the one who needs to define the problems and figure out how they ended up getting solved. And so my question to people is, and I feel slightly disingenuous for doing this, but I usually tell people, because it kind of is a leveling question, I usually tell people this is not a leveling question, this is not a positioning questioning, because I don't want them to pick the highest one so that they the most difficult one just so that they get the most like high leveling marks. Um, like I just want to get a genuine sense of where on that spectrum is a place where you feel confident that you can execute successfully, uh, that you've done it before, and you're very comfortable in that position. You tell me. And people usually are pretty good about giving an answer to that. Those four steps are pretty decent. Um, as far as like defining that area, I think a lot of them have pieces of things that folks are familiar with. Um, and people answer that question for me on their own. And based on that, I can kind of tell you where you're pinned. If it's tasks, it's junior to mid. If it's projects, it's senior. If it's problems, you're starting to verge into staff. And if it's not even anything, then you're probably in the executive tier somewhere. Um, it's not a guarantee. Some people prefer to be given very abstract things, but haven't actually been successful in executing against them. But it at least tells me where what type of thing people want to be given as far as their responsibilities and the scope of their work, which is really helpful regardless. And it gives me a broad sense of like the type of zone where they probably should be leveled.
Do you just ask them just point blank,
Yes.
or is it more?
No, I
Oh
asked
wow,
that
okay,
question exactly as I asked it to you here.
wow. But I mean, there has to be some probing after they give you an answer. Like if somebody shows up and they're just like, no, no, I feel super comfortable with nothing defined,
Yeah.
then what's the follow up?
I don't have any follow up. I guess that goes to the
What?
third pillar. I just take their answer for what it is, and I can figure
Okay.
out. I can generally kind of pin the rest of it based off of conversation. I don't interview people by drilling them with questions. Usually, I just want to have a conversation with them. So I want to hear like, how's it going at your current job? Like, what's frustrating you
Mm,
about it? Why are you interviewing here? Why do you want to leave? Because I want to know, is that thing that's frustrating them something that we also have, or is it not? Right? Like,
right.
I want to
Right.
know,
Right.
like,
Right.
hey, what was the last thing you were working on? Like, how did it go? Like, tell me about it.
Yeah.
Like, what were you involved in? I just want to kind of like hear some stories about like what they're working on and what they're thinking about.
Right.
And through those answers, it also gives me leveling hints, but it allows me to firm up the answer to the leveling question. If somebody's
Okay. So
talking
these.
about things like I was working on a project that I made up out of nowhere because I realized, there was this issue with the company, and because I know that their vision is broad enough, I'm not going to peg them as junior, right? You're not junior if you're picking up on wide-based issues of the company, defining, scoping, and staffing projects based off that is just not
Yeah.
realistic of a leveling point, right? So you can kind of firm up their answer based on the rest of the conversation a little bit as well.
Cool. Okay. Well, my answer to that is indeed the most. Dude, I was employee number 6 at Zeta. Nothing was
There
defined.
we go.
There was no team.
Yeah.
There was a
And as long as they're comfortable
employee.
with that and happy with it,
Yeah.
then that's great, you know. But I also want to make sure that's like what people want. There's plenty of people who've
Yeah.
been in that position. They're like, this sucks, you know, like, and I've fielded a lot of complaints from people about like, I wish that projects were more defined. You know, I wish that there was a little bit more like guidance, and that's like totally reasonable, um,
Yeah.
if that's what you
Can we
want.
can we take a little aside
Yeah,
here? Because in that space, right? Let's give something to the really like executive slash principal distinguished level folks.
sure.
In that space where nothing's defined, and do you? I've there's been, gosh, I'm really struggling
It's
to
okay.
get words out here,
Yeah, yeah.
but in the space, I've often struggled with a lack of vision. Obviously, there's nothing defined.
hmm
But I've often felt an enormous amount of clarity come from conversation and brainstorm sessions. But those things cost time. So, as director of engineering at Clerk and Vercel as well, I'm pretty sure you've played around in that space where nothing's defined or very little is
Oh,
defined.
for sure.
For me, the go-to is let's have a conversation. Let's have a 90-minute call, identify needs once together. This is usually with some executive team. And then we get a direction that maps to protocols, that maps to projects, and so on and so forth. For me, conversation has been invaluable, kind of like this conversation. I think me and you and the listeners are learning a ton. What is that your go-to as well? Is there another strategy you have for bringing sort of order into the chaos of nothing being defined?
Yeah, I am very focused on like customer needs when I think about this type of thing. And I think it's partly reactionary because I've worked at a lot of companies who just come up with what they're going to do based on an internal conception of this is what we should be doing,
Yeah,
and are not really asking like customers or getting any insights from them really at all. And so there's a lot of things that feed into it. Obviously, it's not just like ask your customers what they want, build that. Like it's a nice clean line, but that's not like realistic. There's more dimensions to it than that. But I like to at least start there because
mm,
if you can figure out what are the 5 things that are being most requested by your customers, I would be shocked if at least 2 of those were not things that you should be prioritizing
yeah.
at the top of the list right now. I'd be shocked. It's possible, but like I think it would be quite rare. So I feel like that's a really good jumping off point, um, to
Okay.
figuring out like
What
what are
about
the most pressing things that you need the most for your business. You also want to figure out like how bad is your tech debt? Like every company's got tech debt. Um, that's not avoidable. It is what it is. But like, how bad is it? Is it so bad that your engineers are like really frustrated about it? Are people quitting over it? Is it slowing you down a lot? Are there a lot of issues of like, hey, our like velocity isn't really that high. We're not shipping a lot of things. Things take a long time. Um, that usually is an indication that you probably need some sort of tech debt reduction project in there on the
mm,
tippity top of your priority list somewhere. Even though it's always hard to invest in those things because they're confusing, they're complicated, they go off the rails all the time. It's hard to scope them, um, and there's no immediate value to customers. It's more of like a long-term investment in your company. It doesn't matter; you still have to do them. Um, and ideally, you can get it to a place where you don't have to do it as a project, and it becomes part of your process. That like if you create debt, it's scheduled that you clean up, right? Maybe you need to get
yeah.
something out the door because there's a conference or something you're announcing it at. Happens all the time. Um, you take a shortcut in order to get it out the door in time. Totally acceptable, not an unreasonable decision. Usually, what happens in reality is then you move on, right?
Yeah.
Ideally, your process can be anytime you take that shortcut, after the deadline passes, you schedule time to come back and clean it up, and then you don't have to be putting a project on your company priority map of cleaning up tech debt. You're just generally trying to keep it sustained. But the reality at companies usually is not the case. Usually
Yeah.
debt is pretty bad and needs some active intervention. So probably there's a debt project in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Go
Um,
ahead.
I hear the baby, and I like that. I think we have a
Yeah, 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 yeah.
we have a young intern learning about this stuff
Oh yeah,
also on the podcast.
for sure.
Um, Customers, I love that. I think AWS gets a lot of flack for being awful to use in terms of the console experience and
Hmm.
so on. And
Hmm.
like companies like flightcontrol.dev literally exist because of that.
Hmm.
But I think what Amazon does really well is prioritize customer feedback. That's actually one
Yeah,
of their leadership principles, right? Customer obsession, where
for sure.
they it's not just like listen to your customers, it's which customers. And they weight customers by, okay, whose bill's the biggest? Let's go listen to them. I think
You
that's so
have to.
cool.
Yeah, you have to. Although
Yeah.
clerk is a little bit
But
different in that respect, which is maybe something we talk about later. But like generally, yes. I
I
mean, that's how you want to do it.
I do want to talk about that, but I do have another question in
Yeah.
here, which is in these spaces where oftentimes a lot of things are not defined, and you don't know what projects you need to focus on, and so on. These are also spaces that are very, very early startup spaces where you are pre-customer. You're even heck, you may be even pre-user.
Yeah.
Um, and because you're an early startup, you're probably also pre-tech debt. So,
Yeah.
what then?
That's the best of times. You can all work on almost anything. I mean, when
Mm,
you're that early, almost everything is low hanging fruit that you obviously need, and so just pick it, right? I have this weird analogy. I've put this out several times. Like at the very bottom of your fruit tree, so to speak, all the fruit's low hanging, and it's all hanging a little bit different. Like this one might be slightly more or less important, but you've got this huge batch of low hanging fruit, and frankly, I don't think it's worth the time to spend figuring out whether this one is slightly above or below the other one.
mm,
You could have just spent that time grabbing one of them and working on it because the difference is so small. As you get bigger of a company and more mature, and your product is more mature, the the gaps between how low any of your fruit are hanging widen, right? So I imagine this tree with like very dense fruits at the bottom, and as you go out the tree, they get more and more spread out. And at that point, it does actually become worth it to spend a little bit of time debating and figuring out, hey, what is the gap between these two
yeah,
exactly? Um, so I feel like at startups, generally, it's pretty obvious what to work on. There's like,
that's so
we
cool.
don't have this feature and it's needed for this product to be complete. So we're going to do it,
Yeah.
Um, and I tend to not recommend spending a lot of time prioritizing stuff at the
Mm,
beginning stages. And so it becomes a little bit less of an issue. It's so clear. I mean, even for Clerk, there's a lot of things that are so obvious that like we don't need to spend that much time doing them. It's like we need this in order for it to have a
that's so
full
cool.
featured product. Like one of the things I worked on when I got there was the ability for you to delete your own account as a user. Was there a lot of debate about that project? No. Like how did we not have that?
Yeah.
It's like there was very little time spent trying to figure out whether we need this feature.
But is there debate about? I mean, sure, that's you need that feature, but
Yeah,
would there have been debate, or was there debate about when? Because I mean, resources are finite. You don't have like a million
of
engineers, and
course.
because so much fruit is low hanging fruit, you can't realistically like grab all of them at
You
once.
just take one.
So
There were other
okay,
things that were also very necessary, and there was just one that got picked, and it was fine because if they're both 100% necessary, you just ship one of them, and you
yeah,
only can ship one of them. You just ship one of them. The people that wanted the other one more badly will be mad, but if you had shipped the other one, then the other people who wanted the other one more badly would be mad. So like, as long as
yeah,
the mistake that you made isn't we put a lot of work into something that's not actually that important, then you're good. Just pick one.
awesome. Let's talk about what that looks like at Clerk. Listening to customer feedbacks. Uh,
Yeah,
Feedbacks.
yeah,
Did I
yeah.
just use the feedback as a
Yeah,
plural?
yeah, yeah. Now you're really teeing me up here. So we have this thing that we put out that I'm very excited about, called ProductLane. It is another company's product that I am now shilling, but for free. So I guess it's not shilling. I'm just mentioning them because it's a great product. There's a lot of things that are in this zone that are like this. Probably more people have heard of Canny in that zone. There's a few other ones, product board, et cetera, et cetera. But if you go to feedback.clerk.com, you will find this board of all this stuff that people have asked for and all this stuff that we're working on. And it pulls directly from our linear. It's just a public snapshot of our linear. And you can go on there and look at the projects that we have queued up and are working on, and you can upvote them, and you can say how important they are to you in the upvote, and the more important they are to you, the more your upvote counts, and you can leave feedback about it. So like, I want this feature because X, Y, or Z, or I need this feature, but I would want it to be different in this or that way. And we have a lot of people that use this and give us feedback, partially because we put it on our website and people click on it, and partially because we have internal alignment around using it as a central collecting place for feedback. So like, we will get feedback from our support team. The support team knows that they can put it into ProductLane, and it will get associated with a project in there. We get feedback from like Discord and from our community and from Twitter, and our DevRel team knows that they can go put it into ProductLane. Same with like sales, right? People give feedback on a sales call. I need this feature in order for me to consider adopting Clerk. That's a good, important piece of feedback. Put it in there. So we have some level of internal alignment around the usage of this as our place for collecting feedback. And because of that, we have a lot of feedback in there, which is really nice. And so we can go look at it anytime and see what people want the most badly. And on top of that, we can go into any project that people want and we can get this ream of things that people have written about it. And on top of that, we have a list of all the people who want it. And we can sync that to our database and figure out who they are and if they're a customer or if they're not a customer, et cetera, and use that if we want to for additional weighting and figuring out what types of people want something. Like one feature might be highly desired by like enterprise or business tier customers, and another feature might be highly desired specifically by free tier customers. Does that mean we don't make the free tier one? No, absolutely not. Um, that's far from how we do things, but it's at least an interesting little thing to consider when we're talking about these projects, is knowing like how they go down. So that's
Yeah.
like the beating heart of our like customer centric things. And it's bothered me like crazy that other companies I've worked at haven't had something like this, because it just
Yeah.
gets accumulated from all these different places into all these different departments, and largely it goes straight to the garbage can. Someone might mention it somewhere in a Slack thread and have a couple responses, then it gets forgotten about. Someone might give a response, oh, we're working on that. It's on our backlog, but it doesn't actually get logged anywhere that this person was interested. And I think it's really, really important, if you are a company that cares about weighting customer feedback into the way you prioritize, that you have some system like this that is a central
Yeah.
collection point for all the feedback. And from that central collection point, it needs a way to map feedback to projects. I'll give an
Yeah.
example of this.
This is.
Or
Oh
go ahead.
yes, please.
So we
No,
have
no, no, no.
okay.
I.
So we have this strange detail of Clerk's architecture where it needs to sync front end and back end state. Um, I, I don't want to go too deep into Clerk architecture, so I'll leave it at that. And the result of it is occasionally if you are logged into something and you close the tab and you come back like a while later, it does a little like refresh, um, so that it can sync the state between front end and back end and make sure you're still logged in. And it's not like your session expired. It's just that you left the tab and came back later. I know that that probably doesn't sound like it makes any sense, but I'm going to try to not get into Clerk's architecture here. So let's just leave it at that once again. And this creates this like flash of like a white page, a brief flash of a white page. Um, and it also returns a 401 initially. So it returns a 401 unauthorized, then it redirects you through, it reauthorizes you, and then it brings you back to the page. Um, and internally, this was a tool that we called the interstitial. Uh, but a lot of people had issues with this, or they thought it was a bug, or they thought it would impact their SEO, or they were bothered by the fact that they had a dark themed page, and occasionally they get this flash of a white page in there. And we had all this feedback about this issue that all came in, and it was all different, right? Someone said, "I'm annoyed that like this, I get a 401 code when I run Lighthouse sometimes on my local browser." Someone else would say, "I'm annoyed that there's a flash of a white page occasionally, but I can't reproduce it consistently." And these were all interstitial. But like recognizing that they all were and mapping them back to the same thing is a whole different task. And that I don't think is a solved problem within the like organizing customer feedback thing. And honestly, I don't think it
Mm.
ever will be. But as long as you have a system through which you have some group of people who can look through a stream of things that the people who fielded them are not entirely sure what engineering project it maps to and correctly connect the dots between those projects, then you're in a really good shape. Because otherwise, you just end up with this big mess of like, this person wants no more 401, this person wants
Yeah.
no more Flash of White Page, and they're two different projects, you know, and
Yeah.
they're getting feedback from different places. And maybe there's 3 or 4 different other variants of that. Or maybe someone on the support staff who fielded it just doesn't really know what they're asking, which is reasonable. And I
Yeah.
wouldn't expect them to know what they're asking, right? So that's the one piece that I feel like could be tightened up. We have a way to do that using ProductLane, which again is a great product that I recommend. But like that's all for my spiel. Sorry, go ahead.
That's no, that's really good. I'm curious, and I do want to get to that third pillar. We will,
Mhm.
and then we'll wrap up. But before that, I want to talk about product lane and the decision matrix
Yeah.
around choosing product lane. And the reason I want to do that is because podcast sponsor Stately,
Hmm.
they do exactly the same thing, but they use Canny.
Cool. Yep. Yep.
And
Canny was right up there.
I'm sure y'all had some type of evaluation
Hmm.
process for choosing things, and Canny didn't quite make the cut. And I'm sure Canny people listening would want to know why. But
Sorry,
in
Canny
general,
people.
how would Clerk how does Clerk approach making those decisions?
My camera's all messed up. Okay, we're good. So yeah, it was a careful decision. Canny was 100% in there. It was the other front runner contender. We went through a bunch of other ones um, as well. I think the reason we ended up going with Product Lane was a couple of things. One of them is its linear native nature. So like we use linear for project tracking and engineering, and we really wanted to have one version of reality of what we're working on. Not like this
Mm,
is one version of what we're working on that's over here, and then this is one more version over there. You can connect linear and Canny, but you sort of have to set it up in a few different places because Canny is a bigger, more mature product and it can connect with a bunch of different things. Whereas Product Lane is we sync your linear and that's what your product lane board is. And if you want to
mm,
make a change to your product lane, you make a change to your linear. So linear becomes the actual source of truth for what we're working on, and product lane becomes a layer on top of that where we can just see people's interest in our different products. And that was really nice. You can push things back and forth in both directions. Um, the other reason I think was, and this probably sounds crazy, but like it's a much smaller company, but it's a really, really nice product. It's put together really thoughtfully. Um, and they've come a really long way in a very short time. And I really like making bets on small companies that I think have really good products and being early outsized influence users of companies like that and have done this a bunch of times throughout my career earlier. And it's always paid off big time. Um, and the reason is mostly that they care about your feedback, right? If you're a
mm.
big user of that company's product, then your feedback becomes one of the things that kind of like drives them forward. And we found that Product Lane was like really, really active and like responsive to us, and they like were inviting our feedback and they wanted to work with us. Um, and when we asked for like little things to be like shifted in a direction or brought up something that were like, is it this way on purpose or not? They would respond really quickly and like push out patches to them really quickly, and it was really, really impressive for us. And so they didn't even have like an enterprise tier, and we are like, we want to be your first enterprise customer. This is not the first time I've done this to a company, is say we want to be your enterprise customer, invent an enterprise tier for us because we want to pay you more. um,
That's so cool.
that was how we ended up doing it, and we've just had a really great relationship with them. It's really nice software. It works really well for us. Canny is also really good. I'm sure it would have served us well. Um, but I think the difference was just the type of partnership that we're after. And when there's
Yeah.
software that's that important to me, I really want it to be a partnership. Not like we're a user, but like we're there with you. like
Yeah.
really caring about this software and really trying to help working with it. And I can rattle off a few different companies that we've done this with, but every time we've done it and we've like sniffed out like, hey, this is they're onto something and we want to be part of this, like it's been amazing for us.
That's so cool. I especially appreciate that. Nowhere in the discussion was the statement, "Oh, that's just cheaper." That's why,
No, no, no,
In
no.
fact, you wanted to pay them more because you wanted to invest in
Yes.
that long term part. I
We
think
could have
there's a
gotten it
lesson in there
cheaper. We
for
purposely paid them more money
yeah,
because
and I
it's
think
worth it.
there's a huge yeah, and I think there's a huge lesson in there for software as a service companies that these are investments. These are
Oh yeah.
alliance investments where you can really grow together.
Yeah.
Awesome. I hope there's a takeaway. I hope people actually take that away, like founders and CEOs and such. The value of these partnerships
Oh,
and the value
it's
of
so high.
invent an enterprise tier. I want to support you.
For sure.
Okay,
It
let's
makes
get to
such a
that
difference
third pillar.
in product quality and in everything. And you can get testimonial from them. They get one back from you. It's just wonderful. I love it.
Yes.
I think we talked about the third tier already. We touched on it briefly. It was more or less like the rest of the conversation, right? For leveling,
Okay.
we're talking
Okay.
about, right? So there's the tech
Yes.
evaluation and the handling of ambiguity. There is the direct leveling question. And then there's the broad conversation. And like I mentioned before, I really am not like asking people questions as much as trying to get a conversation going about work and how you think about
Right.
work and how you tackle it and what challenges you've had recently and like what you're thinking about doing and what you want to be doing going forward. And that's an easy thing I think for most people to talk about, I would hope, because we spend a lot of time and mental energy on our work. And someone coming to you to ask you very genuinely, which I do because I'm very genuinely interested, like I want to know what's like on your mind work wise. Like where are you at? Where are you going? What have you been doing? How has it been going? What challenges are you facing? What are you running into? Like, that's a great question to be asked and a great question to answer. And if anyone doesn't really have an answer for that, that's a that's a red flag right there, first of all. But usually people do, and you can get a lot out of that conversation. And it's not like I'm picking apart their answer and being like, oh, they did this wrong or they did that wrong. I'm just trying to get a sense of how you operate within a company and whether that's going to be a good fit for the company that I'm at now that you're interviewing for, and whether it tells me anything about what your kind of like responsibility and vision level is, which usually does.
Yeah. I like that you call out that it's a red flag if you ask someone like, "Hey, how's it going? What's on your mind?" and
Yeah,
they
yeah,
have
yeah,
nothing to say.
yeah.
Um, and indeed, like I think in the interview process, and you can tell me if you agree or not, but in the interview process, everybody's on their best behavior because it's
Mm-hmm.
an interview. It's
Yeah.
it's sort of like going on a first date and everybody's all,
I will dig. I will
dumb.
dig on that. I often have people put up a little front on me.
Yeah.
I will not let anyone get away with it. If they try to gloss over
Good.
something, I will press and I'll press and I'll press until you give me an answer. And maybe that makes you feel uncomfortable. And I apologize to them if it does. But like, I want to have a real conversation generally across the
Yes.
board, frankly. And I think this is something that we've talked about before and have agreed on in friendships and life, but like especially in interview, this is a big commitment. Like you were saying before, it's maybe a little less of a commitment than marriage, but it's a big commitment. You spend a lot of time on your work. You're probably going to be there for a long time, and I don't want to get your like I don't want to get your script of what you wanted to say with an interviewer back. I'm going to get the real thing, and uh, I feel like I've gotten pretty good at that. To the point where like I've had multiple people come out of interviews being like, I didn't expect to say any of that stuff that I was saying. Like, I'm like embarrassed about it. I don't know how you got me to say all those things. I'm like, don't be embarrassed about it. Like, this was an actual conversation, not an interview. It's fine. I'm not judging you for any of it. Like, thank you
Yeah.
for opening up, and I'm glad I could help you to
Yeah.
do that.
There's this reminds me of that. There's a TV series called Lucifer,
Hmm.
where Lucifer is sort of just chilling around Los Angeles, and he's a
Hmm.
club owner, and he does this thing where he looks at someone, he goes like, "Tell me what you really want," and
Yeah,
like they just start opening up, and it's
that's
um,
me interviewing. That
yeah.
exactly. So watch out.
No, I think that's great, but here's what I wanted to ask you, and it's two questions.
Hmm.
One is that changes over time.
Hmm.
I have to believe that changes over time. Yes, you'll come prepared to an interview, ready to answer questions. Sort of like you in this podcast. You come ready to like, I'm going to answer these questions.
I
But
did not, by the way.
but then but you're you're doing a really
Well,
great job. And
thanks.
I think, you know what? I think we may need to do another one because like we're just on question 3 of like
Oh
72.
yeah.
Anyway, we, I, so you come to the interview and you come prepared with answers, and even if it's not a script,
Hmm.
it's you open up
Yeah, yeah,
because you
yeah.
know that it's good to open up.
Right.
But if somebody then ends up getting the job, and you've obviously managed teams that have a long arc, at some point, have you noticed situations where you ask in a one-on-one, how's it going? What's on your mind? And the answer is, nothing. Or it's very
All the time.
scant in terms of
All the
information.
time.
Okay, how do you deal with that? I mean, so I can share with you as a manager myself, I've had some real closed books.
Hmm.
Um, and I've thought about it long and hard. I was like, how do I get this person to be comfortable, be safe, open up? And a lot of them even tell me, I've asked them directly, like, hey, do you not feel safe or comfortable? They're like, no, I feel totally safe and comfortable. It's just I have nothing to talk about with you.
Yes.
And I said, well, how?
I get the same thing.
Yeah, could you maybe speak to navigating that?
I
Like
get it all the time.
what?
I'd say I probably get it from like maybe half of my reports on average, usually. And for me, that usually indicates somebody who is focused on getting their work done, frankly. And I try to not see it as they have a lot of things that they're thinking about and they want to say, but they're holding back on me because they don't trust me. I try to not. I mean, I'm sure that is the case in some situations. Um, I'm positive, but I think that I usually relate it to a scope of vision thing. If your scope of vision is, I'm working on this project, I'm trying to get this shit done, we're moving along, everything's fine, you probably don't have anything else to say other than that. And that's fine. I have no problem with that. I don't think that that's a negative thing for somebody's career. I don't think it indicates anything bad about them. And a lot of the like most talented, most highly paid people that I have managed have given me answers in this way. And I don't think it's a problem. But it's just a difference in like the wider your vision is, the more things you're probably seeing and probably want to talk about, you know? And the more narrow it is, maybe the less things you have to talk about. And especially if it's a manager who's not in the project with you, who's not, someone that you would want to pass your technical decisions by necessarily, they might just not really have much to say. And when that's the case, I like you've mentioned that you do, I try to make sure that those people feel comfortable telling me things if they have things to tell me, but I'm not going to try to squeeze something out of them that's not there.
Mm,
And oftentimes I'll space out the one-on-ones a little bit more because if they don't have something to say most of the time, then probably we don't need to like meet every time. And they're like, oh yeah, we're good. I don't have anything. Um, and I kind of just take it for what it is.
but do you not feel like that sort of that they're biasing too hard towards hard skills and not investing in soft skills? And
No,
again, I don't say soft disparagingly, but like
no, no.
it at some point you prioritize or bias towards code and the details so much that you forget how to engage with human beings. You sort of devalue the human connection because you're just like
That's
heads
their
down.
choice.
And
It's not my choice. And I fully respect that choice. And I think every company
but
needs
is
people that are like that, who are just, I'm
but
going to get this done.
what if the choice is unhealthy and or maladaptive? Because ultimately we need human connection. And as a
Sure.
manager, is it not part of your job to like look out for their health?
I don't. I think that would be me imposing my values on them. To be honest,
Whoa.
you know, I
No, that's good.
I- it. I want to again. I want to make sure that they are comfortable talking to me if there's something they want to talk about. But I'm not going to try to force them to talk about things if they feel like, hey, you know what, I'm getting my work done. Like we're doing it. I think that's fine. And I'm not going to force them to have a relationship with me if they don't want to have a more personal relationship to me. A lot of my reports do, and I have great personal relationships with them. We talk about things outside of work for half the one-on-one, and I still think that's valuable because that's part of what you bring to work is what happens outside of work. And I think
Yeah.
there are other people who are like, I don't want to get into that. Like that's my business.
Yeah.
I have people I talk to outside of work. Um, that I use for my human connection, and you're not the one, and that's fine. I'm not offended by that.
Yeah.
I'm here if you need me,
Yeah.
and that's it.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I've in a past life I've been the manager who wanted to be everybody's
Yeah, yeah,
best
yeah.
friend.
I get it. I totally
It
get it.
did
I
not
mean,
work. Yeah.
as you said, your point is fair. Like you want to connect with these people, you want to be a good resource for them. But
Well,
I think there is a certain line where you're just like, hey, look, I'm
yeah,
here to provide what I can provide for you.
yeah. I want to share with you, and we'll wrap up with this. I want to share with you one huge lesson I've learned as I've transitioned from from like early career to late career. Like this is especially so I just turned 31 and I feel like this is like the chief lesson
Okay,
of my
I'm,
30s. I
I'm
know
pumped
I'm
for
still
this.
young
This
into
is
my
great.
30s, but oh my gosh, this is such a big lesson I learned,
Mhm.
Jeff, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on it because here's the deal. I when I was early in my career, and by early I mean I had an internship at 15, first full-time job somewhere in my early 20s and so on. In all of it, I always thought, and this is I'm recognizing now as a fallacy, or at least I call it a fallacy. I'm so curious about your thoughts. I used to think bring my full self to work meant I am the same person at home, at the gym, in on the sports field, in the locker room,
Yeah,
and at work. I am my true
sure.
authentic self,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so I would often bring like cursing and fun, well, quote unquote fun language and all kinds of different things into the workplace. And some managers would criticize me. They're like, "Hey, that's not professional. What are you doing?" And others would say, "Hey, that's so genuine. I love it." And for me, the managers that said you're making people uncomfortable with how many f bombs you drop and I was just like, yeah, but I'm just being me. I can't be a different person. I have to be me everywhere. And this was my big thing in my early 20s
Mm-hmm.
where I was young and foolish.
Yeah,
And the big lesson I've learned later in my career is actually it's about showing honor. It's about showing honor to people, but also it's about showing honor to the context. You have to honor context. So you can be respectful to the context of work, and that maybe that's not to say you don't drop any f bombs,
sure.
but you still honor the context. Versus if you're in a locker room, you honor that context, and if you're hosting a podcast, you honor various contexts. And this is not being not genuine.
Yeah.
It is still being your full self, but it's being your full self honoring a specific context and being context appropriate. I'm curious, is that something you've faced over your tenure? What would you say to that if one of your reports came to you with that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. That's great. Thank you for telling me that story. That was really cool to hear. Yeah. I mean, I've had a lot of back and forth with this for sure. I think even outside of work, I have. I, I genuinely am a very, very direct person overall. I really value honesty and like genuineness, even if it's bad, all the time. And this is not a normal U.S. cultural value. I actually have no idea where it came from, to be quite honest, because I don't think my family is like this generally either. Um, but it came from somewhere, and like that's kind of like if you want to say like what's the thing that like is the most unusual like defining part of me and having a relationship with me, it's probably that. You can always expect an honest answer out of me, even if it's not something that's going to make you feel good, because otherwise, I don't feel like you could trust if what I'm saying is something that I'm saying to make you feel good, or if it's something I'm saying because I actually believe it. And if you're in that space, then what kind of relationship do you have with me
Yeah.
in the first place, right? If you're always having to second guess everything I say, um, I just hate that. And I think it's very normal to act the complete opposite way of that. And so, for a lot of my life, a lot of my career, I have tried to find ways to press people into scenarios where they rotate into behaving the way that I behave. Because I feel like it helps to build more genuine relationships when you do that. I really feel that way, and I still do. Um, and the methods I've used to do that have been varied and interesting over time, and maybe we could talk more about those later. But that has always been something that has been a bit of like a thorn in the side of my career, maybe in a
That
similar
you've
way.
been that you've been too direct and
Yes.
you've sometimes used language that wasn't appropriate to the context or
It wasn't so much like inappropriate language as just being very direct about things and wanting to
mm,
engage very directly on things. Like if there's something I didn't agree with, I would say that I didn't agree with it, and I would say why. And I wouldn't do it in a mean way, I don't think, but even just the experience of having somebody tell you very directly that they disagree with you is very disconcerting for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
um, I think I thought about it in largely the same way that you thought about it. Is like this is my value, and I really stand by this value because it's important to me, and I feel like it's a really helpful tool in being genuine and establishing genuine relationships. And so this is what I'm going to do. And
Mhm.
what I missed, I think, about that in the same way as maybe you did, is that if I'm acting that way and I'm making other people feel uncomfortable, then I'm just being an asshole, frankly. Uh,
Yeah.
and regardless of what I think my values are, and a lot of the time, if it makes somebody angry or offended or uncomfortable, then they shut down. And so then I don't really get the benefit of having the genuine relationship in the first place either. So not only am I acting like an asshole, but also it's not serving the goals that I set for that value in the first place. And it took me many, many years of relatively clear feedback about this point, uh, which shows you how dumb I am, to really get a handle on this. And it was always a struggle for me because I didn't want to give up on that value because it remains a super, super important value to me that's been absolutely defining and pivotal and like all of the like, best things in my life. But I feel like I found some sort of a middle ground, which was like well, roughly what you're saying with context, but like there are multiple contexts even within work. And there
Mm.
are people who I guess I like try to sniff people out a little bit. Like, is this somebody who wants to have a real relationship with me and wants to hear what I actually think, or is it not? And if it's not, then that's not what I'm going to give them because then I'm just going to be making
Yeah.
them uncomfortable and I'm not going to be serving my goal anyway. I'm just going to accept this is what they want. I'm not going to try to change them or transform them or whatever. It's not my responsibility, and usually it goes wrong when I
Yeah.
try anyway, and it backfires.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to make sure that people feel happy and they feel safe and they feel comfortable in whatever capacity that they want to work with me. And so I have the like sniff out period, and that's very very difficult to do. And I've gotten more and more complex and like nuanced in the way that I do it. But I'll tell you one thing that I do that might be interesting to you is I will say something that I believe that I know the other person disagrees with, and see if they'll disagree with me. This is like one of the
Mm.
easiest tests that I've found in the world. If the other person agrees with me, then I know that they're not really trying to be honest about things and they're just trying to make sure that everything's cool and everyone's happy. And I have to change my behavior based on that. I need to be very, very careful in the way that I deliver them things. I need to be very careful in the way that I hear the things that they say, and I need to look for other cues about whether they believe it or not. And I mean, you can see whether somebody believes something or not if you look at them carefully when they're delivering something that you know they don't believe, right?
Yeah.
People get really excited about things they believe in. The tone of their voice changes,
Yeah.
the animation changes, they lean in. You can just tell if you're paying attention and you're looking for it, and you're a human being with a shred of emotional intelligence, you can tell. And you can
Yeah.
tell when somebody is agreeing with something or saying something that they don't actually believe. And I put a lot of emphasis on that. And I've worked with a lot of people who will tell me things that they don't believe and be relatively convincing about it. And I realized later that I'd been deceived. And I looked back and I remembered like the way it was delivered with these kind of like, I don't know, kind of like dead eyes. I like to describe it as like a convincing performance otherwise, but there's always something that you can use to pin down like they're not being honest. And
Mm.
when that happens, I think you hit a crossroads. Are you going to call them on it and see if they fess up to it and change, or are you going to let it go and be like, this is just somebody who's I can't trust? you know?
Yeah.
And it's really really hard to figure that out, honestly.
Yeah.
And I've probably gone way too far with this answer, but I hope it's interesting.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, I especially empathize with the moment you said when you tell them something you know they're going to disagree with, but they don't, and you know they're not being genuine, then you have to be extra
Oh
careful,
yes,
and you have to watch how you engage. That I've been there myself. I am there in a few
sure,
relationships here and
of
there,
course.
business
Yep.
relationships, and man, those are so exhausting, aren't
It's
they?
not a
Those that, like
relationship I
being
want
that.
to invest in, right? But like
Yeah,
sometimes those are people that work at your company, and
yeah.
you have to be aware of that. So
Yeah.
like,
Yeah, and
yeah, for sure.
it's adaptive. You
Yes.
just have to know. Yeah. Well, listen, Jeff, it's been such a pleasure. Look, it's not every day I get to sit down with
Thanks,
the
man.
director of engineering at so many incredible places with such an excellent track record, who wrote such an really such a masterful handbook.
I'm
So I
glad
want
you
to
like it, man.
take a moment and just really thank you for your contributions, for coming on the podcast, for sharing all of this with me.
Sure.
I don't take it lightly, and really thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thanks for having me on. This is really cool. I'm hoping to actually put out some pieces of that handbook at some point. I just had to go through it and whatever. Taking something from
Awesome. Yeah.
private to
Whenever.
public obviously takes a little bit of
Yeah, whenever it's
but
out,
yeah,
we'll
I would love
definitely
to. I
do our
mean,
best
hearing the
to go
fact that
post.
you got something out of it is great. I hope other people would be able to as well.
Thank you for joining me for my discussion with Jeff Escalante. I hope you got out of it as much as I did. Honestly, I could listen to Jeff over and over and over again, and I really hope we get to schedule something again, because honestly, we scratched the surface of our discussion document. And so, if you want to hear from Jeff again, would you go on social media and at him? Also, if you're learning from and or enjoying this content, please share it on your social media. If you also want to leave up to a 5-star review on Apple and Spotify, that would really help. If you have ideas for topics you want us to cover, or guests you want us to have, or any feedback at all, leave comments on YouTube. I read all of those and I prioritize them to serve you the best. Once again, thank you to all the sponsors. Thank you for being a part of it, and thank you for your interest in engineering.